I checked into the hotel under someone else's name. That's what I always do when I travel alone, just in case. A little precaution goes a long way, right? I even use a fake phone number and a prepaid credit card that isn't linked to my real name. It's a habit I picked up after reading too many horror stories about solo travelers getting stalked. The hotel was decent, nothing fancy but clean and in a good location. I was in town for a short business trip, staying just 2 nights. As I got my room key, I made a mental note of the lobby layout, the exits, the stairwells, the security cameras. A man stood near the elevators, watching me. He was in his late 40s, thin but tall, with neatly combed hair and sharp features. He wore a dark sweater and jeans, nothing remarkable, but something about him made me uneasy. He smiled. "First time here?" I forced a polite nod, gripping my suitcase tighter. "Yeah, nice place," he said. "I've stayed here a few times." He stepped into the elevator with me. I pressed my floor number. He didn't press anything. The doors shut. The elevator hummed as it started to rise. "So, what brings you to town?" he asked, glancing at my suitcase. "Just work," I said, keeping my answer short. He nodded, as if considering something. "Travel alone often?" I forced a smile. "No, my boyfriend is meeting me here later." That was a lie. His expression didn't change, but I saw something in his eyes shift. The elevator dinged. My floor. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to exit first. I hesitated. I didn't want to turn my back on him, but I couldn't just stay in the elevator, either. I stepped out. He followed. I walked quickly to my room, unlocking the door as fast as I could. He kept walking down the hall slowly, casually, as if he had all the time in the world. I shut and locked my door the second I was inside. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. That night, I had a dinner meeting. When I got back to the hotel around 10 p.m., the lobby was quiet. I walked quickly to the elevators, my heels clicking against the tile floor. As I reached out to press the button now, a voice behind me. "Hey, you dropped something." I turned. It was him, holding a folded piece of paper. I hadn't dropped anything. I knew that. My purse was zipped, my hands were empty. But I took the paper from him anyway, just to get him to leave me alone. I stepped into the elevator and pressed my floor number. He didn't follow me inside this time. As the doors closed, I unfolded the paper. There was only one sentence written on it. "Room 714, right?" My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't told him my room number. I hadn't even said what floor I was on. I got to my room, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the handle. My hands were shaking as I called the front desk. I told them about the man. The woman on the phone was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have a guest matching that description." I felt sick. "Are you sure?" He said he stayed here before. "I can check our records," but she hesitated. "There's no room 714 in our hotel." I froze. I turned and looked at the plaque on my door. Room 714. I felt lightheaded, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Ma'am," the woman asked. I hung up, and then a knock at the door. Soft, slow. I didn't move. Another knock. Then a quiet voice, muffled through the door. "You gave them the wrong name, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. I didn't breathe, didn't move. The knock came again. Louder, more insistent. I backed away from the door, reaching for my phone again. Then, the door handle turned. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The chair held, blocking it from opening. The handle rattled again, harder this time. Then, silence. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Finally, I dared to look through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stayed awake all night, my body tense, waiting for another sound. Another knock. Another movement. But nothing happened. By morning, I checked out and left as fast as I could. Before I walked out, I glanced at the door plaque one last time. Room 714. But when I passed by the front desk, I overheard another guest checking in. The receptionist smiled at them and said, "Welcome. We have you in room 714. I stopped cold. The guest took the key, thanked her, and walked toward the elevators. I turned back to the receptionist. "Excuse me," I said. "That's my room." She gave me a puzzled look. "I'm sorry." I hesitated. I was just in room 714. She shook her head politely. "Oh, no, ma'am. That room's been vacant for weeks. We just opened it up again today." I felt a deep, stomach-twisting dread. Then, "Where did I sleep last night?" She frowned, tilting her head. "You checked into room 514. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that wasn't right. But my name was right there on the reservation, listed under room 514. I walked out of that hotel without saying another word. I don't know who, or what, was in room 714, and I don't think I ever want to. Story 2. I was already on edge before I even boarded the plane. My flight had been delayed for hours, my phone battery was almost dead, and I was running on barely any sleep. All I wanted was to sit down, close my eyes, and not speak to anyone until we landed. It was a full overnight flight from South America back to the US. I had the window seat, which I preferred, so I could rest my head against it. The man in the middle seat was older, probably in his 50s, dressed in a loose button-up shirt. He gave me a polite nod as I sat down. But the person in the aisle seat? Something about him put me on edge immediately. He was young, maybe early 30s, with sharp cheekbones and deep-set eyes. His skin was sallow, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hands were clasped tightly together in his lap, fingers twisting in slow, unnatural movements. I turned my attention to the safety instructions, forcing myself to ignore him. Then the plane took off. As soon as we reached altitude and the cabin lights dimmed, I felt it. A presence. Not movement. Not a sound. Just the overwhelming sensation of being watched. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the aisle. He was staring directly at me. Not blinking. Not reacting. Just staring. I swallowed hard and looked away, pretending I didn't notice. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was in his own head, lost in thought. But something deep in my gut told me that wasn't it. I forced myself to relax, pulling my hoodie over my head and closing my eyes. The exhaustion was catching up to me, and despite the unease creeping under my skin, I started drifting off. Until I woke up to the feeling of breath on my face. My eyes flew open, and he was inches away from me. He had leaned over the middle seat, his head tilted at an impossible angle, his mouth slightly open as if he had just been whispering something. I jerked backward, slamming into the window. What the hell? I gasped. The older man beside me grunted, waking up from the movement. What's going on? I looked at him, then back at the aisle man. But he was sitting normally again, facing forward, hands folded neatly in his lap, like he had never moved. My skin crawled. The older man gave me a confused glance but shrugged and closed his eyes again. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Maybe the exhaustion was making me paranoid. Then I saw something on my tray table. A folded napkin. I hadn't put it there. I hesitated before reaching for it, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded it. There was something written in tiny, precise handwriting. Don't look at him when he moves. A deep chill spread through my body. I slowly turned to look at the older man beside me. He was awake again, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking straight ahead, stiff, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The aisle man's fingers were moving. Not his hands, just his fingers. They were twitching, bending in sharp, unnatural motions, as if each joint had a mind of its own. Then, his head started to turn, but not like a normal person. Too slow, too smooth, too wrong, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. My breath caught in my throat. I snapped my eyes shut. Don't look at him when he moves. I gripped the napkin so tightly it crumpled in my hands. I sat there, completely still, every muscle locked in place. For what felt like an eternity, I heard nothing. Then, a whisper, right next to my ear. You shouldn't be here. I jerked forward, gasping for air. The older man beside me did the same, as if he had just been released from something. I turned toward the aisle, and the seat was empty. The aisle man was gone. The seatbelt sign was still on. There was no way he had just gotten up and left. I looked at the older man. He was pale, shaking. Without a word, he unfolded a napkin of his own. In the same tiny, precise handwriting, there was a single sentence. We landed hours ago. Story 3. I don't remember booking the cabin. I had been traveling through Eastern Europe for a few weeks, moving from town to town, staying in cheap hostels, and taking whatever transportation was available. One night, I was scrolling through my phone, half asleep in a train station, trying to find a place to stay for a few nights before heading home. That's the last thing I remember before waking up inside the cabin. Not in a hostel, not in a hotel. A cabin. I sat up, my body stiff and aching. The room was dim, the walls old, made of dark wooden planks. A single window let in a weak sliver of light, covered in a thin layer of grime. My backpack was neatly placed in the corner. My phone was on a small table beside the bed. The door was locked from the inside. I checked my phone immediately. No service. The battery was half full, but my call history was empty. No records of booking a stay. No messages. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Maybe I had been exhausted and booked something last minute, half conscious. Maybe I had gotten a ride from someone and just forgotten. That was possible, right? I got up, went to the window, and looked outside. Endless trees. Thick, gnarled branches stretched in every direction, the forest floor barely visible under layers of tangled roots. I didn't remember traveling into the woods. I didn't even remember leaving the city. A knock at the door made me freeze. It was soft, gentle. Then a voice. "Are you awake?" I swallowed hard. "Who is it?" A pause. Then, "Breakfast is ready." The voice was female. Calm. Soft. But I didn't recognize it. I hesitated before unlocking the door and slowly pulling it open. A woman stood there, smiling. She was tall, her hair long and dark, her skin pale. She wore a simple blue dress, and her hands were folded neatly in front of her. "Good morning," she said. "You must be hungry." I stared at her, my mind scrambling for an explanation. "Where am I?" I asked carefully. She tilted her head slightly. "At the cabin, of course." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. "How did I get here?" Her smile never wavered. "You booked a stay. Don't you remember?" I didn't answer. "Come," she said, stepping aside. "You should eat." I didn't know what else to do. My phone had no service, and I was miles from anything familiar. So I followed her. The hallway was narrow, the wooden floor creaking beneath my steps. The cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly sweet, like flowers, but off. She led me to a dining area where a small table was already set. A plate of food sat in the center, eggs, bread, something dark and sticky smeared across the slices. I didn't sit. "Do you live here?" I asked. Her eyes flickered to me. "I take care of the place." I looked toward the windows. The trees outside were too close, almost pressed against the glass. "Is there a road nearby?" I asked. She smiled again, as if amused. "You don't remember arriving?" My fingers tightened around the chair in front of me. "I think I should go," I said. She exhaled softly, tilting her head again. "But you only just woke up." Something about the way she said that sent ice through my veins. I turned to grab my things, but when I reached the hallway, the cabin had changed. The door to my room was gone. The walls had stretched, elongated. I whipped around. The woman still stood by the table, watching me with her soft smile. I bolted for the front door. I yanked it open and ran straight into the forest. Branches whipped at my arms and legs as I tore through the trees, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air smelled damp, thick with earth. I didn't know where I was running. I just knew I had to get away. Then, I saw the cabin again, in front of me, as if I had never left. I stopped, my chest heaving. My eyes darted around the forest. I had been running in a straight line, hadn't I? Then, from behind me, "Are you feeling better?" The woman's voice, closer than before. I turned, my stomach dropping. She stood just a few feet away. Her dress was no longer blue. It was black. Something inside me snapped. I ran again. The trees blurred past me, my vision dizzy from panic. I kept going, my legs burning, my body screaming for rest. Then, I saw it. A road. I stumbled forward, barely able to breathe. And then a headlights. A car. A real, actual car. I ran into the road, waving my arms wildly. The vehicle screeched to a stop, and a man rolled down his window, looking at me with wide, startled eyes. "Jesus, are you okay?" I gasped, nodding frantically. "Please, I need to leave. Now." He didn't hesitate. He opened the door, and I threw myself inside. As we sped away, I dared to glance back at the trees. The road was empty. No sign of the woman. No sign of the cabin. Nothing. I tried to explain what happened, but I didn't even know how. The man drove me to the nearest town, where I got a room at a real hotel. I barely slept, checking my phone every few minutes. Still no service. Then, at 3:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. A notification. "Thank you for your stay. Come back soon." No sender. No number. Just a black and white photo attachment. A picture of the cabin, with the door wide open, and something standing just inside. Story 4. I was flying home after a long business trip overseas. I was exhausted, running on barely any sleep, and I just wanted to make it through the 8-hour flight without any issues. The plan was simple: window seat, headphones in, sleep until landing. But I never made it to the end of that flight. The boarding process was normal. I had an aisle seat in the middle row of the plane. To my right was an older man who was already asleep before takeoff. To my left, by the window, was a woman, maybe in her late 20s, dark hair, thin, wearing a heavy gray sweater despite the warm cabin temperature. She never made eye contact, never looked at the flight attendants, just sat perfectly still, staring out the window. I try not to think much of it. People travel alone all the time. Maybe she was just nervous. The plane took off. An hour passed. Then 2. I had dozed off when I felt something. A faint pressure against my arm. The woman. She was leaning toward me. Not like she had fallen asleep. Like she was deliberately pressing against me. I shifted uncomfortably, clearing my throat, trying to move away without making it obvious. She didn't react. I turned my head slightly to glance at her. Her eyes were wide open, and she was staring right at me. I nearly jumped out of my seat. Her face was too close, her dark eyes unblinking, her lips slightly parted as if she had been about to say something. I forced a nervous laugh. Sorry, do you need something? She didn't respond. She just kept staring. I turned away, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. I reached for my phone to check the time. That's when I saw her hands. They were on her lap, fingers twisted into tight, rigid shapes, like she was trying to form some kind of sign. And her nails were black. Not painted black. Blackened, like they had been burned. My stomach twisted. I turned back toward the aisle, trying to focus on my breathing. Maybe I was just overtired. Maybe she was sick. Maybe. She grabbed my wrist. Her grip was ice cold. I gasped, turning back to her, her face right next to mine now. And she finally spoke. A whisper. You shouldn't be here. A shiver ran down my spine. What? I stammered. She didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed at my chest. I looked down. My seatbelt was unbuckled. I froze. I had buckled it. I knew I had. Before I could react, turbulence shook the plane violently. The lights flickered. People gasped. The woman didn't move. I hurriedly buckled my seatbelt again, my heart hammering. The turbulence passed. The plane steadied. And when I turned back, her seat was empty. The blanket she had wrapped around herself was still draped over the seat. But she was gone. I looked around wildly, my pulse racing. There was nowhere she could have gone. The seatbelt sign was still on. I turned to the older man beside me. Did you see where she went? He blinked at me groggily. Who? I pointed at the empty seat. The woman sitting there. His face paled slightly. No one was sitting there. I shook my head. No, she was right there. She spoke to me. The man's expression darkened. I've been awake for the past hour. No one's been there. I turned back to the seat, my hands shaking. And that's when I noticed something under the blanket. A single boarding pass. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The paper was yellowed, crumpled, as if it had been in someone's pocket for years. The flight number was the same as mine. But the date? It was from 10 years ago. And the name on it? Mine. Story 5. I always loved road trips. There was something freeing about driving for hours, watching the scenery change, pulling over whenever I wanted just to take in the silence of an unfamiliar place. That was the plan. A solo trip through the countryside of a foreign country, where the roads stretched endlessly through fields and forests, dotted with tiny villages that barely appeared on maps. I rented a car in a small town near the border. The rental guy handed me the keys, barely glancing at me. Don't drive at night, he muttered as I signed the papers. I laughed. Why? Dangerous roads. He looked up, his face unreadable. Something like that. That should have been my first warning. But I didn't listen. The first few days were uneventful. I stuck to the main roads, passing through quiet towns, stopping at gas stations where locals barely spoke English. Then, on the 4th day, I decided to take a detour. The map on my phone showed a shortcut, a narrow, winding road through the hills that would shave an hour off my trip. It was surrounded by dense forest, but it was still a road. It looked perfectly safe. I took the turn. At first, everything seemed fine. The road was smooth, the trees towering on either side, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in golden streaks. Then, I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road, an old model, covered in dirt. The driver's side door was wide open. I slowed down slightly, peering inside as I passed. Empty. No sign of anyone. A cold prickle ran down my spine. Maybe they had walked off into the woods. Maybe they had gone for help. But why leave the door open? I kept driving. 5 minutes later, another car. Same condition. Old. Dusty. Driver's door open. No one inside. A creeping sense of unease settled into my gut. And then my engine sputtered. My heart lurched. No. Not here. The car slowed against my will, the gas pedal suddenly useless under my foot. I checked the dashboard. Full tank. No warning lights. I rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. Silence. I tried the ignition. Nothing. The trees stood tall around me, unmoving. Watching. I reached for my phone. No signal. A rustling sound made me freeze. From inside the trees. I turned my head slowly toward the noise. At first, I saw nothing. Just endless green. Then a shape. A figure standing between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but definitely watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I tried the car again. The engine stuttered. The figure took a step forward. My pulse skyrocketed. I tried the ignition again. The figure moved closer. And then, I saw more. Shapes emerging from the woods. Not one. Not two. At least 10. All standing between the trees, their faces hidden in shadow. Just watching. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel. Come on, come on, come on now. The engine roared to life. I didn't think. I just hit the gas. The car lurched forward. I swerved around the abandoned vehicle ahead, my tires kicking up dust as I sped down the narrow road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. The figures were standing in the middle of the road now, and they were smiling, not running, not chasing, just standing there, grinning, like they had let me go, like this was some kind of game. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking as I got out. The attendant gave me a strange look. You okay? I nodded, gulping down air. My car, it broke down back there. In the forest. His face changed. He glanced at my car, then back at me. And it let you leave? I stared at him, my skin turning ice cold. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just filled up the car and got the hell out of there. I stuck to the main roads for the rest of my trip. But even now, I still think about it. About the cars with their doors open. About the figures standing in the woods. And about their smiles. Like they were saying, next time, you won't be so lucky.